Okay. Hello? Okay. Yeah. Okay, good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for coming. We have a very intimate little group here. My name is Rhoda Shermer, and I want to welcome you on behalf of North Jersey Public Policy Network. We are very lucky tonight to have a great speaker, Gordon McInnes, and many of you, I think, know him. To me, he's the guru on New Jersey issues. He's been a state senator. He's been an assistant commissioner with a big budget. He's now the president of New Jersey Public Policy Perspective. And they do a great job with reports, and it's a very well-respected think tank. And that's the short version of Gordon McInnes. You're going to hear tonight the context of how New Jersey got into the fix that it's in, and hopefully how we can resurrect ourselves. So I'm not going to take up much of your time. I want to have Gordon do his job, but I did want to say that Gordon is going to have to come back in 2016 because I had loads of people register for this program who contacted me by email and phone telling me to cancel the program because they needed to go to a freeholders meeting, some candidates nights, and all sorts of things are happening tonight, which is like the perfect storm. So I was not going to cancel the meeting and the talk. So we're going to look forward to a future talk by Gordon McInnes in 2016. So meanwhile, let's welcome Gordon McInnes.
Good evening. Actually, I think the problem is that nobody expected that the New York Mets would drop Game 4 at home, and that instead they did, and in fact, in a few minutes, they're going to throw out the first pitch in Los Angeles for them to move on. And as a loyal Mets fan, I don't think I could have accepted this had I known that they were going to drop the fourth game. So I'm here tonight to talk largely about bad news about New Jersey and to look at the reasons that the news is so bad. This is not an accident of history. It's not a product of a terrible storm. It is instead a result of people who are elected or appointed to represent the public interest in the discharge of their responsibilities as governors, as legislators, or as members of the Supreme Court, to live up to, first of all, their promises, but to secondly, honor the Constitution in making decisions and that affect all of us. And I wanted to start by just calling your attention to this rather jammed up two-pager on one piece of paper, to save money, of course, which charts some of the examples of some of the metrics of what's going on in New Jersey. And you'll see that there's a lot of where the issue is poverty, unfortunately the curve goes up. Where the issue is income, unfortunately the curve goes down. And when you flip over, for almost all of us, this will require the use of your magnifying glass when you get home to read the map of the United States. What that says is that this is the comparing the revenues available to state governments before and after the recession. And those that are in blue have seen their revenues recover. Those that are in red have not. And you will find, again, if your magnifying glass works, that New Jersey is ahead in the Northeast for having the deepest decline in revenues since the recession. And with all of the talk that is on, I think that One of the explanations for that is in the bar chart above, which shows that in terms of creating jobs, after the recession, New Jersey is way behind. It's way behind our neighbors. It's way behind the nation. It's way behind just about every state on the Atlantic seaboard. And that is a major explanation for why our color is red on the map below, because we're witnessing a number of high rankings in the nation for such things as people who have been unemployed for more than 6 months, veterans where we have the highest unemployment rate, foreclosures, where we have the second highest rate of mortgage foreclosures. And I don't know if you saw it recently, there was a counting of zombie homes, those foreclosed homes that have been abandoned, and New Jersey's first in the nation in that category. And you could pick any number of indicators like that, and you would have to conclude that what we are suffering from is not the national economy. It's not the regional economy. It's not the mid-Atlantic that's in such peril. It's something that is special here in New Jersey. And it's unfortunate, of course, and it leads to real doubts about the future. And in putting this in context, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about a rosy past, the glory days. I think that's the title of a Springsteen song. He's a Jersey kid. I mean, don't ask me for the lyrics. But New Jersey has had two advantages that were very large when compared to other states, compared to states that we would be competing with for jobs and economic activity. The first advantage we had was the 1947 Constitution, which took a state that was fractured, decentralized, and that was reflected in the character of its government, and it created a real contemporary government involving a powerful executive, a powerful Supreme Court, an independent judiciary, with the governor able to overcome the fragmentation that characterizes New Jersey. We have, of course, 9 million people in 565 municipalities. We've got 610 school districts. We've got numerous fire districts, and we have a very complex place. Most of us live in a part of the state which veers towards New York for news and information and entertainment and lots of things, and about a third of the state veers towards Philadelphia. It's really hard if you're in the legislature, for example, even if the person is from the same party, if they're rooting for the Phillies, or if they're rooting for the Flyers in particular. Anyway, that's what characterizes New Jersey, is that it is a fragmented, split state that is a corridor. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who characterized New Jersey as a valley of humility between two mountains of conceit. And he had in mind New York and Philadelphia when he said that. So we have a 1947 Constitution that allowed for the creation, the development, the evolution of a state government that was actually effective and efficient, where governors would have enough time to make changes, and they would be able, and they really were handed a microphone in a state where it's very difficult to communicate, where people do not have the benefit of living in a state with a city the size of New York, or a place that, like Boston, Mass, or Atlanta, Georgia, or Chicago, Illinois, a place that sort of brings everybody together. There may be tensions and jealousies, but there's a voice, there is a symbol for the state. People can find out about things. Our largest cities are in the neighborhood of 250,000. I think Jersey City will probably overtake Newark maybe next week and become the largest city in the state. But either way, it's not going to be like they're jumping into the skin of New York City or Boston, Massachusetts. So we have the strong governor. The Constitution also did two other things, which are important for the discussion tonight. They imposed a sensible, the authors of the Constitution imposed a sensible, effective, and conservative financial set of practices on the state. And it took the form of something called the Debt Limitation Clause and something called the Appropriations Clause. And what counted was that for more than 4 decades, those two clauses were honored by legislatures and governors of both parties, whether in the majority or the minority. There was a practice that was embedded in the culture of New Jersey's government and politics, which said that if you have an annual budget, you may not spend money that you do not raise, and you cannot pass the bill on to a future legislature if the budget is spending $11 billion and you know it's only going to raise $10 billion. You can't push it off on the next legislature to deal with that $1 billion. And it also says that you cannot borrow money to balance the budget. If you borrow more than 1% of the total budget, you're in violation of the Constitution. And nobody ever thought in the first 4.5 decades after the Constitution was ratified that no one ever proposed. I don't even think they even imagined the idea that you would, for example, borrow long-term to balance this year's budget. And the other part of the Constitution was also very clear, and that was that the state could not incur debt unless it was approved by the public. In a referendum, then that would create general obligation bonds that would be honored and would be seen by Wall Street and bond buyers as secure and thoughtfully proposed and accepted and very likely to be paid back. And we're going to come back to those two clauses in the Constitution in the discussion of what went wrong. But I want you to remember that the Constitution is very clear about it. Most of the court decisions were quite strong in protecting those clauses. There were exceptions. The Turnpike Authority was created in the late 40s. Somebody said, well, the Turnpike Authority can't borrow money to put up the toll booths and build the highway. And the court said, well, wait a minute, this is not an instrumentality of the state. The state's not on the hook, and it's developing a secure revenue source that will more than repay the bonds, and this is permissible under the Constitution. They made some other exceptions, but basically, in 1994, when the year opened, New Jersey had about $3.5 billion in general obligation debt, and slightly more, not quite $5 billion, in other forms of debt long-term, either called revenue or contract bonds, that went primarily to things like the State Building Authority to construct and or lease office buildings for the state employees. And and it also had approved the creation of the Hackensack Meadowlands Sports Complex. And because we were all guaranteed, weren't we, that with horse racing in the backyard of the stadium, that would easily take care of any bond repayments that would be undertaken to build an 80,000-seat football stadium. And the court accepted that, and it turned out not to be quite true. But otherwise, there was very little that had been done by way of borrowing, except for those bonds that borrowing which had been approved in a referendum. Okay. There was a second advantage that helps explain how New Jersey really sort of transformed itself from a gray industrial corridor state of little note to the point where it became a true economic powerhouse. It's bounced out of recessions with much greater speed than most other states. It had and has today among the highest incomes in the country, the greatest wealth in the country. It underwent a transformation which I think is best explained by a change of leadership that took place in the 60s and persisted into the early 90s. Governors of both parties, Richard J. Hughes, William Cahill, Brendan Thomas Byrne, Thomas Kean, and James Florio. They had a point of view, maybe unspoken, that New Jersey had assets that needed to be developed. If they were developed, it would bring much greater opportunity to the residents of the state. It would increase the economic activity. It would lead to the creation of better jobs. And the people were put in charge of deciding whether these were the kinds of investments that should be made or not made. If you think back to 1965, Richard Hughes was running for his second term in office. The County College of Bergen did not exist. Ramapo College did not exist. Nobody had even mentioned Ramapo College in 1965. New Jersey's higher educational system was very small compared to the population of high school graduates coming out each year. We had 6 teacher training institutions, Rutgers, primarily in New Brunswick, and the Newark College of Engineering. There was no public medical school. The campuses of Rutgers at Newark and Camden were quite modest. And we had a governor who put forward a commission to study the future of higher education, the advantages and disadvantages. They went through a bitter fight against the education establishment and created a Department of Higher Education which produced a master plan which led to a bond issue which was overwhelmingly approved by New Jersey voters, which permitted the investments in 2 brand new liberal arts colleges, one in Ramapo, one in Stockton in South Jersey, to the creation of a public medical and dental school in Newark, to an expansion in facilities at the liberal arts college or the teacher colleges that were going to be converted, and new investments at Rutgers. And assistance to counties in creating county colleges. And the change was enormous. And it took some time to be implemented, but New Jersey became finally a sort of 20th century state in the area of providing publicly supported higher educational opportunities to its population. In 1965, there was no Department of Transportation. There was a highway department. All of the public transit in the state was privately owned. All the rail service being provided was run by bankrupt companies. And New Jersey ended up with taking the same approach, creating a new Department of Transportation and the third largest public transit corporation in the country, New Jersey Transit, which took over the bankrupt train service, commuter train service, took over the bus service that was being run by Public Service, the utility company. And we began investing by public approval of a very large bond issue. We began investing in not just highways and bridges, which had been the pattern of the past, but also in a new system of public higher education, which has been expanded to include light rail service, has been modernized to take the Midtown Connector, for example, and which has enjoyed recently a steady rise in people who are making use of that. Close to 1 million people a day ride trains or buses to get to work. That's not quite 25% of the workforce in New Jersey, but it's important. And it was a big change that had to be made. We did more in the areas of environment. We certainly are. We were a badly polluted state. We passed some of the strongest environmental protection laws, pollution control laws. It was Congressman Florio who was behind the creation of the Superfund to clean up polluted sites. New Jersey, of course, ended up with the longest list of such sites in terms of cleanup. And we got into the business of conserving land. We created, through successive bond issues, all of which were overwhelmingly approved, and this goes back before 1965. But during this time, we set aside close to 1 million acres in the Pinelands in a federal-state cooperative piece of legislation that has conserved the land above the largest aquifer of clean water on the East Coast. That's threatened in the minds of protectors of the Pinelands by proposals to run new gas lines through them. And there has been an effort to develop deeper into the Pinelands than was true for many years. So what this showed was that New Jersey has assets that are very valuable and very competitive that need to be supported, invested in, improved on. And let me name quickly the 5 of them that count the most. First, location. No other state. This cannot be changed. It cannot be changed by law. I guess it could be changed by the most massive earthquake ever suffered, but there is no other state that is in the middle of the world's largest consumer market that has access to New York, the most important city in the world, in the north, and Philadelphia in the south. No other state can duplicate that. That's ours. It helps explains why we were called a corridor state, because people wanted to get through us to get to New York or Boston or back down to Philadelphia or Washington. And that's a huge advantage. It's only an advantage if you maintain, modernize, expand a transportation network that permits some efficient movement of people, cars, trucks, goods, services through, around, across, within the state. And if you've paid any attention to what's going on, you know that a fund that was established in 1984 by Governor Kane, called the Transportation Trust Fund, is running out of money. It will run out after June 30th. Excuse me. After June 30th, The Department of Transportation, New Jersey Transit, will not have a dime for new projects or to expand current facilities or to purchase new train cars because every dollar committed to the Transportation Trust Fund will be spent to retire bonds that have been issued to create capital projects in New Jersey. There is not a spare nickel left. And even that has been accomplished, frankly, by underinvesting in the public transportation side of transportation. In fact, this year, the New Jersey Transit Corporation was required to repay a bridge loan that had been extended by the state because of the difference in federal payment calendars. The state had effectively loaned money to New Jersey Transit until the federal money came in. Simultaneously, they required that to be repaid. It was $270 million, and permitted the Transit Corporation to raise fares for the 5th time in, 10 years, with a noticeable increase that took place on October 1st. So the transportation is key to our future, and the idea that we would shortchange the Transportation Trust Fund, or we would not move every possible obstacle to completing a new rail tunnel to New York, which is absolutely essential to our future and to our present. I mean, we're relying on 2 single-track tunnels that were built 105 years ago, and both of which were inundated during Superstorm Sandy, both of which have suffered from the corrosion that follows with salt water coming in contact with all that metal and electrical mechanics, and with a very strong possibility that the tunnels will have to be shut down one after the other for as long as a year to be put back in working order. And here's what that would do. That would reduce New Jersey Transit's rush hour inbound trains in the morning and outbound trains in the afternoon from 24 an hour to 6 an hour. Amtrak would be reduced from 6 trains an hour to 2 an hour. It would be a disaster for all of us who live in towns that have convenient rail service to New York and to the Northeast Corridor. The third asset is that New Jersey benefits from having among the best educated workforces in the nation. We have the highest percentage of engineers, researchers, and scientists in our workforce of any state. You know, everybody keeps talking about tax cuts being the vehicle to economic growth. And recently we've seen some corporations that have decided to locate new jobs in New Jersey. Just this week, Nestle announced, all right, the world's largest food company, after conducting an international search where they would be happy to locate it any place in the world because they are truly a global corporation. They selected Bridgewater, New Jersey, for the location of their new large research and development facility. And why did they do that? Was it because we have tax subsidies available? Did they mention that? They didn't. They mentioned 2 things about it. One, we want to be in the center of a workforce that is as educated as New Jersey's, where we will not have to start off by worrying if we can recruit the people we need to run this new, beautiful, expansive research facility. They're here. We've checked it closely. Secondly, it puts us in the middle of the greatest market, where a lot of people want to be, which helps explain why New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the Union by a lot. So we have a great benefit in the education level of our workforce. And that's a product, in part, of attracting people from around the world and around the country to come here because it's close to New York or it's close to Philadelphia or because their company located a research lab in New Jersey. But it also reflects the fact that we've got 2 globally recognized research universities, that Princeton and Rutgers, which helps explain a lot of activity. If you go on Route 1 between Princeton and New Brunswick, or head up between Princeton and Bridgewater, you encounter, first of all, an awful lot of traffic. But secondly, you also see an awful lot of facilities that are dedicated to biogenetics or to pharmaceutical research, and they create very good jobs for a lot of people living in New Jersey. The biggest triumph we've had since the recession in terms of the number and quality of jobs being located and added to the New Jersey workforce is the decision by LG Electronics to locate its North American headquarters in Englewood Cliffs. Now, here's 2 facts about that decision that are important. The CEO of North American operations for LG was asked, gee, why are you locating in New Jersey? Why'd you pick Englewood Cliffs? His answer wasn't the typical one, well, we worked with the governor and we were pleased with the tax benefit. Nothing like that came out. He said, well, because we want the children of our workers to go to very good public schools, and they can be found in Bergen County. That's why we're here. That's probably not the only reason, but it's a good reason for us to amplify, and we should be proud of the fact that New Jersey is second only to Massachusetts in how well our public school students achieve on the gold standard, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And you wouldn't know that listening to the public conversation about public schools in New Jersey, would you? You'd think that we've got ferocious, incompetent, lazy teachers. You would think that the only answer to improving education in New Jersey would be to have new schools created by private corporations or nonprofits. None of that is being advertised in our public discourse, and it should be near the top. The 4th asset we have related to all of this is that we've got a lot of places which make for very good living. Close to places you want to be, convenient to New York up here, Philly in the south, pleasant, vibrant communities with their own business centers, with also excellent public schools. That is a part of the mix that gives us such strong advantages that need to be recognized and taken advantage of and praised and invested in, not neglected or ignored as I think they've been. And finally, and this is a very big asset, New Jersey is 3rd after only California and New York in the percentage of our population which is foreign-born. 25 years ago, 10% of New Jersey's population was foreign-born. Now it's 22%. We have the largest Asian Indian population in New Jersey. We're the only state where immigrants from India are the largest immigrant group in the country, in the state. And that's a big advantage. So LG Electronics, while the CEO did not say it, I'm betting the fact that Bergen County has one of the highest concentrations of Korean residents had a lot to do with a Korean corporation which employs Korean nationals as well as people from around the world, I bet you it had something to do with their decision to come to Englewood Cliffs. They're pretty close to Fort Lee, aren't they? Or to Cliffside Park. I mean, there's some, yes. So that is a big advantage for New Jersey. And again, it's something where we need to see that reflected in the policy discussions, because there are things that could be done to enhance and improve the experience of immigrants to this state. And instead, we've been rather dismissive in the public conversation. That's enough background. Should I stop? No, I've got to go on. I want to mention. Actually, I thought about this, and there are 10 things I want to bring to your attention. 10 events, 10 decisions, all consciously made by the people I've already cited. That is, governors, legislators, and justices of the Supreme Court. 10 events that have taken us from, in 1993, we were one of 8 states that had received AAA credit ratings from the 3 major credit rating agencies. One of 8. Today, except for Illinois, we are the lowest rated state in the union. And that is only, 22 years ago. We went from the top to the bottom in a relatively short time. And I think it is fair to assert that the decisions I'm going to discuss briefly here help explain how something like that could happen. And it all starts in 1994. And I will make a disclaimer. I was in the state Senate in 1994. And this is not out of bitterness that I lost the argument on some of the things I'm going to outline. I think the evidence is pretty powerful that this is a fair description of actions that were taken that have endangered our future and have helped explain our decline in a large number of indicators. Okay, the first thing that happened in 1994 was the proposal to reduce the income tax rate. I hate to say that. I don't derive any pleasure writing checks 4 times a year to, what is it, State of New Jersey-GTI. And I wish I could keep the money that I'm sending to Trenton and do better things with it. But here's what's behind the income tax. Al Burstein had a lot to do with that. And in fact, if you're against the income tax and you don't like paying it, you can talk to Al. He bears full personal responsibility for the... So what happened? The income tax was enacted only because it was put to referendum for the people to amend the Constitution to require that every penny raised by the income tax would be devoted to relieving property taxes. And for 40 years, to this day, for 40 years, the biggest complaint in every public poll seems to be that my property taxes are too high. And so the income tax was seen as the instrument to do 2 things, frankly. One is to relieve property taxes, and 2, to respond to the Supreme Court order for changing the school finance aid, the school finance formula. When you reduce the rates by 30%, you don't get, the results that are promised. I want you to think about this. Income taxes in 1994, when this was initiated, let's say we're raising about $6 million. The first cut was 5%. The second cut was 15%. Put those 2 together, it's 20% cut in the rates. And you might therefore save $1 billion. that would be shifted, $1.2 billion, that would be shifted from the state of New Jersey to the pockets of taxpayers in an economy of $350 billion. Now, what would be magical about those $1 billion that would allow somebody to suggest that this will magnify and create a storm of new economic activity when you're shifting around such a small percentage of the total amount being generated in New Jersey? It doesn't make any sense in the world. Those are not different dollars. But that is the rationale for so much of what we hear about when we hear about tax cuts. But what it did do, and this is not a surprise, is it? If you cut the income tax rates by 30%, you reduce the amount that you'll receive by way of income tax collections. And since every penny has to go for property tax relief of school districts, municipalities, and counties, and individuals who qualify, that will reduce the amount that you're able to invest in property tax relief. And it did. Our organization did a careful study after 10 years, estimating that the tax cuts had resulted in a loss of $14 billion in 10 years in revenue to the state, which is a noticeable amount of money. And it would be impossible, because of changes that have been made to the income tax law in the interim period since then, to come up with a very precise number about the impact of that tax cut in 1994. We've assigned different percentage rates to people at different income levels, and we've taken some people off the rolls for having to pay. So it would not be possible to estimate that, but that gives you a pretty good approximation of the impact of reducing the funds available for property tax relief. The second thing that happened, and I won't go into detail on this, although I claim to understand it, was a revision to the pension laws. It was called the Pension Reform Act of 1994. It was passed with very little conversation, with very little notice by the legislature. And it did two things. It changed the actuarial assumptions by shifting from entry age to unit credit, and don't ask me any questions about that. The outcome of that was using that new assumption, it reduced the actuarially required contribution by the employer, which meant that the state and local governments were able to reduce the amount that they had to put into the pension fund. And that was celebrated, even though the funds that would have gone into the pension fund then could have been invested for a longer period and with compounded returns would have increased the money available for people when they retire. That was not pointed out. The second effect of it was that it authorized the administration to take what had been gains in the market and to use those gains not to be invested for the future, but to be used as the employer's contribution to the pension fund. And that meant the money would not be available for investment. That was the second action that came along. The third was taken in the same law. I'm going to mention it separately because it's a big number. Retiree health benefits are different from pensions because the employee does not pay an actuarially determined amount that's deducted every 2 weeks from their paychecks. Instead, the employer does. And they were initiated under Governor Kane and sustained under Governor Florio. And they both did the same thing, which is they increased the employer contribution so that it would cover and provide assets to be invested for paying future retiree health benefits. As a new program, not many people were eligible for it. In fact, during the Whitman years, the annual payment for people who were then retired was around $175 million. This year, it's around $2 billion. But by putting that retiree health benefit program on a pay-as-you-go basis, instead of investing in assets that would be compounded and would grow over the years, so that as people retired, there would be the funding available to pay for those health benefits. Each year, the amount required to pay for this year's retirees has to be included in the budget. And if you think about it, $2 billion out of a $33 billion budget is 6%. All of it going to one program that was established to be funded through the good sense of a pension fund. Now, the fourth thing that happened is, I believe, qualifies as one of the most reckless steps ever taken by a governor in New Jersey and maybe in the United States. And that was in 1997. The governor proposed that New Jersey borrow $2.8 billion from Wall Street to meet the employer's share of the pension obligation that had grown as a product of the changes made in 1994, and that those funds would be poured into the pension fund at a time when, yes, the market was moving up, and it looked like a good idea maybe to maximize the amount you had to invest. However, it overlooked what we started the conversation with. It overlooked the obligation of the state to meet its annual contribution required by the pension actuaries each year. Not to ask taxpayers in 30 years to make the payments on the bonds that allowed Governor Whitman to fund the pensions in 1997, 1988, and 1999. Now, there's a big problem with pension obligation bonds. This, by the way, was the largest bond issue ever issued by New Jersey. It was at the time the largest pension obligation bond issue ever sold. Illinois in 2010 broke our record. But until then, we held it. There's something else about the pension obligation bond issue which is particularly gnawing at this in the last 10 or 12 years. This is not a tax-exempt bond, and it is not callable. What that means is, if we have a general obligation bond or even and we sold the bonds at 6%, and today you could refinance those bonds at 4% and save hundreds of millions of dollars in interest payments, which is what you can do, this bond you cannot call. So it is at 7.65%, which in the municipal bond market, that's a junk bond today. At the time, it was seen as that was a time of some inflation. It was seen as a reasonable amount to be paying out. But the contrast between that and municipal bond rates is very substantial. And the taxpayer is the one who pays it back. We're going to end up paying back about $11 billion on that. This year, we're going to pay $340 million for that. In 2020, it'll go up to $500 million, and it will remain over $500 million. It will remain there for 8 years until the bonds are paid off. So this is a double whammy on the finances of New Jersey, on the health of our pension fund, and on taxpayers having to devote money for something for which they receive no benefit. And it's unlike every other bond issue that the state has undertaken, which has produced something tangible. It's produced, acres of preserved woodlands that you can traipse through on Sunday afternoon, or it's produced a laboratory facility on the campus at Rutgers, or it's produced a bridge expansion or a replacement, something that you could see and touch and that will be used for a long time. This is not used at all. And it's gone, but we get to pay for it. The fifth thing that happened was that the New Jersey Supreme Court did not stop the bond sale. And a part of that was explained by the efficiency of the bond sale after it was signed into law. And this is unusual. First of all, it was proposed as like it would be tax exempt and callable. It turned out not to be. It was approved, I think, on June 7th. It was sold, I think, on June 27th. 20 days. Lawsuit was brought the day the bill was signed. It was heard in the Superior Court. The court found that, oh no, this is, the state is not obligated to pay it. The EDA is, which is an instrumentality of the state, appointed by the governor of the board. So it's not really an obligation of the state. And the fact that there's no revenue stream to pay back the bonds is not considered germane. Therefore, it can go forward. And the appellate division held up that decision 2 days later. It went to the court. And because of the speed with which the bonds were sold, the court delayed its decision until June 20th, or actually June 27th, June 30th, excuse me, 3 days after the bonds had been sold, and said it's moot. The bonds are sold. We can't disrupt the sale. It's gone. Judge Handler issued a stinging dissent that the court had just violated the Constitution's debt limitation clause and appropriation clause, and that we would be paying the consequences for this if it can be done with such ease. And he turned out to be right. The sixth action was taken in 2001. Governor Whitman had departed to join the Bush administration as the Environmental Protection Administrator. The Senate President, Senator DeFrancesco, became the acting governor while he was also the Senate President. That's been changed subsequently, but that was the way it worked at the time. He was also interested, it was reported, in running for governor. And that was a gubernatorial election year. And he had Republican majorities in both houses and proposed that we increase pension benefits by 9%, not just for people who are working now and will retire in the future and are therefore contributing every paycheck to their pensions, but we're going to extend that to people who are already retired and who did not put any money in for this 9% increase. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to jump in a time machine. That's not what the governor proposed, but that's really what it turned out to be. And we're going to create something out of the past called a Benefit Enhancement Fund, and we're going to pick one day in 1999 to establish the value of the stock market. We're going to compare that with what was required to be in place actuarially, and we're going to say that that difference will pay for the 9% increase, which, do you understand that? And I don't think anybody who voted for it understood that. And by the way, it took 9 years for the SEC to understand it, and it led to New Jersey, again, taking first place in this, becoming the first state, I believe it's still the only state, to be found to have fraudulently misrepresented its in its bond prospectuses the financial capacity of the state to repay the bonds. And the SEC found that, in fact, it disguised an absence of payment by the employer from the years 1994 to 2007. And that it was a huge consequence that that money had not been invested in the pension fund, and New Jersey had to sign a consent decree that it would never do that again, and acknowledge that it had done that in the past, and that the bonds that were floated during that time, when New Jersey was not being accurate in describing how it was going to pay for the bonds, we went from roughly $5 billion in revenue and contract bonds that I've talked about to $30 billion in just that time. In short, the combination of the Supreme Court decision on the pension obligation bond issue and the DeFrancesco, and this was done with members of both parties signing on to it, so it's not a one-party problem, that led to a surge in the issuance of bonds and debt, which has placed New Jersey, which accelerated New Jersey's decline in terms of its credit rating, in terms of its financial capacity, in terms of its ability to invest in the assets that count. I'm going to combine the 7th and 8th events into one and just say that Governor McGreevey took over at a time of recession shortly following the 9/11 attack, with all the consequences that that had for economic activity in the metropolitan area, and with a budget that had been framed by his predecessor that was not correct in estimating the revenue. It badly overestimated the revenues, and it underestimated the spending, with the consequence that Governor McGreevey walked in with takes the oath of office. What date is that, January 20th or something? January 20th. The fiscal year ends June 30th. That's 5 months and 11 days, right? He had 5 months and 11 days to close a $3 billion operating deficit in the budget. And the idea, and the budget at the time was $24 billion or something. It's a big part, 12% of the budget. And what could you do in 5.5 months? You're just getting your cabinet organized, the new legislature's in session. So that was a real blow. And he came up with the idea to fill part of that hole, that he would take the funds that Philip Morris and Laurel and all the tobacco companies had agreed to pay to states under the tobacco settlement, which was in 1998. New Jersey's share at that time was around $275 million a year. And the idea was that you would use the money to prevent people from taking up smoking. Because the basis of the litigation was, gee, because of your encouraging all these people to smoke, we're left with the bill. When particularly Medicaid patients and other people we're responsible for end up with lung cancer and emphysema, we pay the bill. You got to pay us for that. And we'll use the money to prevent people from taking up smoking. We'll help them stop smoking. And we live up in New York. We get to see, near New York, we get to see the New York smoking ads, right? They have these people who look just awful, and we get to see pictures of their lungs, and you're really not encouraged to smoke when you see that. I guess they're effective. So New Jersey was in line to get about $275 million a year from the tobacco companies. Governor McGreevey said to bond buyers, we'll give you the $275 million, but you give us $2 billion right now. And we'll pay this back to you over whatever number of years. and it's yours. And there's no chance that people are going to stop smoking tomorrow, and that money is secure, and it's only for 11 years. And so they sold $2 billion worth of bonds and dumped it into the budget. So that was billions of dollars that would not be available down the road that should have been available to the state. By the way, New Jersey turns out to be the only state in the union. Here's another source of Jersey pride, right? The only state in the union that spent not one penny of the tobacco settlement money on preventative programs or advertising. Anyway, that's irrelevant. The second thing that Governor McGreevey did was in the following year, still facing large deficits. He said that we should increase the price of a pack of cigarettes, and that we will devote that money, we will dedicate it to repaying the bondholders who are going to dump money into our budget this year. And we'll repay it over a 30-year period. And we're also going to charge we're going to have a surcharge on people who've been convicted of dangerous driving habits. And they're going to pay a surcharge, and that surcharge will also be dedicated to the bondholders who will be helpful in dumping this money into the general fund. We're still paying all that off. And it is over $2.5 billion over 2 years that was used to help balance the budget. The ninth event. We're getting close to the end, right? Does anybody have the Mets score? No? Okay. I'm interested. The ninth event was a series of cases that went to the New Jersey Supreme Court on the very issue we've been talking about. The issue that you cannot borrow money to balance the budget, number one. Number two, that if you borrow money, you have to have the public approve it. This was brought by the mayor of, how do you say that? I would say the capital of Colombia, I know, is Bogota. And how do you say that town that's spelled exactly the same way? Bogota, okay. Excellent. Oh, no, that's not excellent. Oh, dear. He reports it's 2-1 Dodgers in the first inning. I'm going to quit right now. Mayor Lanigan brought suit against the bonding practices that appeared to violate the constitutional debt limitation clause and the appropriation clause. The court heard the case because he identified 5 or 6 different bond issues that made his case. And included in that were the bond issues by the EDA to build new schools in the Abbott districts that flowed from the Abbott decisions to change the financial structure to assist urban districts, both in terms of their operating budget and in terms of their capital facilities, which were outdated, unsafe, crumbling, et cetera. The legislature had approved $8.6 billion in funding by way of EDA bond issues, $6 billion of which went to the Abbott districts, $2.6 billion went to non-Abbott districts in the form of a 40% state payment on their bonded indebtedness for school construction. So it was, a lot of districts benefited from this money. The court, in its first decision in Mayor Lanigan's litigation, said, you know, Mayor, you didn't really produce enough information on all this. We're going to send this back. We want you to argue this before another court. And then it can come back to us. But here's what we're going to do before that happens. We're going to say that the $8.6 billion that you've challenged as being issued by the EDA, that is constitutional because it deals with the problems of the schools where we've found that they're entitled to special treatment and a fair treatment. And therefore, the clause in the Constitution which guarantees every child between the ages of 6 and 18, are those the ages, Chairman Burstein? Okay. That clause in the Constitution trumps the debt limitation clause. And we're going to, that's off the boards for controversy. Come back to us. They came back, Mayor Lanigan did come back to the court specifying the sports complex bonds, the state building authority bonds, et cetera. And the court dismissed it in a very closely decided case that was with a vigorous dissent. And it dismissed it, finding that the state was not liable, that there, in most cases, there was a secure revenue stream, there was no liability on the taxpayer, and there was no reason why those issues had to go to the public because of those facts. Finally, after Mayor Lanigan brought his case, when the cigarette and motor vehicle surcharges were being proposed, the court accepted a case brought by the minority leader in the Senate, Leonard Lance, who's now a congressman, challenging the right to borrow money to balance the budget. The court found that Lance was right, but it said we don't want to disrupt this budget session, and you'd have to redo the budget. That would be, so we're going to allow this to go through. We're going to grandfather any borrowing that took place before today, but you can't do it anymore in the future. So at least that stopped borrowing to balance the budget. But it did not deal with all the other revenue bond issues that have created this massive debt overhang. And the final action that I think has accelerated the decline is a little different than all of the ones I've talked about, and that's the cancellation of the ARC tunnel in 2010. And I mentioned it at the start of my talk about the fact that if the Northeast Corridor is shut down because you can't move between New York and New Jersey by train, then New Jersey is in for a terrible economic downturn, because so much of what we've built, so many of our assets assume that there's convenient access to New York. If you've got 80,000 people taking trains to New York every day, and now they're going to be in cars, can you imagine what the Lincoln Tunnel is going to look like? Or the bus line and trying to get into the Lincoln Tunnel, if they can actually discharge. So this was an opportunity. It was an imperfect opportunity, to be sure, because Amtrak was not party to it. It involved only New Jersey Transit. The federal government produced half the money. The Port Authority produced a third of the money, and New Jersey produced about a quarter of it. That was the deal. It was roughly for $14 billion. This is not a cheap deal. It was canceled by the governor, and the funding that had been set aside by the Port Authority was immediately employed to bail out the Transportation Trust Fund, and half of it went to the reconstruction of the Pulaski Skyway. God knows that is needed. But that's what happened to the funding from the opportunity to deal with the rail tunnel. Still a problem. And as you know, the governor now supports what's called the Gateway Project, being advanced by Amtrak, which would include New Jersey Transit and would be, again, a two-track tunnel. And this would maintain Penn Station as the endpoint. The lowest number that's available on that is $20 billion. it's likely to be higher. If they had the funding in place tomorrow morning, it's likely that the earliest those tunnels would be available, that tunnel would be available, would be 2030. So we've got two decrepit, crumbled, dangerously ineffective single-track tunnels that are the lifeline for New Jersey and the entire northeastern corridor, with every likelihood that we're going to see a shutdown in both of them before the new tunnel can be built. So that's my encouraging report. Now I'd like to turn to the bad news that we face. No. So why talk about this? It's all in the past. And, you know, none of it involved criminal activity, none that I know of. You can never be sure, can you? And so what's the value of pointing out that all three branches took these actions together, politicians from both parties, and yes, it's a shame, but it's in the past. And here's the reason. If we do not identify accurately how we got into the fix we're in, if we do not identify the source of the problems, about the actions of deferring to future taxpayers payments for benefits that they do not receive still going on, if we can't have a candid conversation about the nature of the problem, its origins, its magnitude, and the causes of it, then what is the likelihood that we will change direction in the future? And will the crisis that we face, and I haven't gone into the details of this, except to say the Transportation Trust Fund is broke, and putting a nickel on the gas tax will not change that. And we are $130 billion behind in having the assets in place to pay off pensions and retiree health benefits. $130 billion is not a number you can get our heads around, right? It's just too big. However, that's what it is. But because it's a long-term, complicated machine that we're talking about, even small changes made now could greatly reduce the consequences of the non-payment by employers over these past years. In fact, the 2010 or 2011 legislation that was approved on a bipartisan basis that put out a payment schedule for the employer and reduced benefits for employees, when added together, reduced the unfunded liability by $120 billion over 40 years. That's a big number. It's a long time. That assumed that the employer payments would be made. They have not been made. I don't know exactly what part of that $120 billion will be recognized as a lowered liability. But you can see that there's a lot of leverage in addressing these issues now with something, and not throwing up our hands and saying nothing can be done. And I would say the same thing's true of the Transportation Trust Fund. New Jersey has got the second lowest gas tax in the nation. It has not increased the gas tax in 25 years. It's increased fares for the train riders, but it hasn't increased the gas tax. 30% of it is paid by people outside New Jersey. There are lots of reasons to say, since the network of roads, highways, bridges, and public transit is at the heart of our economic advantage, we better do something. And it ought to be something that will be secure, and for at least 10 years. It has to be a pretty big number that's put forward, because otherwise the bond repayment schedule will eat up very quickly any modest increase I'm talking about a nickel a gallon. That will be gone in 1 year practically because of the curve of repayments required. So the hope is that bringing this to everybody's attention somehow will at least direct a more authentic and accurate conversation, a public conversation, about where we are and what we need to do. And I think then at least we will have a fighting chance. Left to what we have now, which is more nonsense, more completely focused on the next election only attitude by our political leadership. And we have to include in that the fact that our governor is seeking the nomination of his party right now, which does not favor doing any of the things we're talking about. And he does not want to, I mean, maybe he should just, maybe he will stop shortly, and we will be able to get back to the question of what we're going to do in New Jersey, or maybe he's going to linger, and in which case the chances of solving this problem shortly will be diminished. But with all that good news, I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions. Best to Ruth. So. I will. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this information. There's so much we just talked about. As a lifelong resident of New Jersey, these are things that I should have known when I did, so thank you for that. A question regarding the pension and benefits bill that Governor Christie signed into law. The educators have been meeting their part of the bargain. They've been putting in the money. Governor Christie signed his name to that pension and benefits bill.
Right.
He has reneged on his promise. Is this grounds for impeachment?
The question was, there was a law enacted which required the governor to make payments to the pension fund on a schedule set forth in the law. He has not honored that law. The public employees affected by it have put in every dime required by the changes in the law, and some have seen their benefits altered. Is the governor's failure to make the payments grounds for impeachment? It's a political question. Well, I guess it is. I mean, impeachment has no boundaries. I mean, you can bring charges. Is it realistic to assume that if you brought those charges, that you would find a sponsor, first of all, for the hearing? I think that would be very difficult, even with the decline in the governor's approval rating and the apparent failure of his search for the presidential nomination. I think that would be hard to do. And by the way, he's not the only governor guilty of such things. There have been 5 or 6 laws enacted that acknowledge that the full employer payments had not been made, that they should be made, that they can't be made in one budget year to catch up. Therefore, we're going to agree that over a 3-year period, over a 5-year period, over a 7-year period, or over a 10-year period, the employer will make the full payment, phasing it in. Those are all laws that were enacted. Governors of both parties have said, oh, gee, I can't do that. I think it would be a tough argument to make on the people who have to do the impeachment. That Christie stands out in a way that his predecessors didn't, and that he's held to a higher standard. I don't know. Yes, sir.
debate and make decisions, and they may know that there's a long-term problem to be done, but they are willing to sacrifice that because when they're in the Senate and Assembly, they can get their time, they can get their pensions, and to hell with New Jersey 40 years from now.
Well, everybody hear the question? The question about members of the legislature of both houses being more attentive to their long-term interests rather than the impact of making these decisions that harm the public over time. Sure. You have elections every 2 years when you're in the Assembly. I had the good fortune to serve in both houses. I was a Democrat from Morris County. I don't know if you know what that means. I can tell you in 212 years or whatever it's been, when Morris County and the Democratic Party have coexisted, they've only elected 7 Democrats. And they were only elected in 3 different years prior to that. 1911 with Woodrow Wilson. I don't want to get into that. So 2 years is not a long time, and particularly from a district like a hostile district like that. So people scramble to make sure that they are positioned as well as strongly as they can be to be reelected. Everybody wants to be reelected pretty much, and they all think short term as a consequence, and it's really hard. It's really hard to get them to think otherwise. A crisis will get them to think otherwise. Could. Not always. Strong leadership at the governor's office could get you to think otherwise. Developments in your district could influence things, but it's really hard to. And don't forget, this is probably more important. New Jersey is a top-down political state. It's not a grassroots state. It's a top-down state. The things we're talking about are decided in the end by 3 people: the governor, the speaker, and the president of the Senate. Now, the governor is by himself or herself. That's his or her decision. The speaker and the president of the Senate are open to challenge and dissension and tension and all sorts of things from the members of their caucus that have elected them to be the presiding officer. So they got to be a little more careful. They can't just do what they want to do. They have to reflect what's going on in their caucus on controversial issues. So, in the end, if the Assembly Speaker doesn't want to do something because this year his members are up and the Senate is not, he will protect his members. And so if there's something important that the governor and the Senate president agreed to, and they get it through, the Assembly Speaker will not do it. He wants to hold on to his job.
Has that changed since 1993?
Pardon me?
Has that changed since 1993?
No.
That's why it was working until 1993, AAA rated, and now it has changed, obviously.
Right.
Right? Has it changed?
No, it worked the same way up until 1993. Here's what you had that was a little different. You had, in some cases, you had really big majorities. So in 1973, Byrne won, and the Assembly was 66-14 Democratic. Like, you can lose 25 votes and get everything passed, right? So some things happened in years like that. The same thing happened with Dick Hughes in '65. Democrats took the Senate for the first time since 1911. And they had both houses, the big numbers. And they got an awful lot of the stuff I was describing done in that time. But But there was something else that was going on that is not true today. And I think it's generally recognized, it's certainly recognized in Washington. The spirit of solving problems was much more bipartisan in those years, much more. And it was, here's the example I'll give you. I was elected to the Assembly in 1973. I served for one term, 74 to 76. The Assembly is a circus. We'd go and have sessions that would last till 3 a.m. It was craziness. Sometimes we'd get out at 7 o'clock at night. We'd all be so excited by that, we'd all go out to dinner together. Republicans and Democrats, reporters, people from the governor's office, well, lobbyists, and we all end up at Lorenzo's restaurant and we have a great time. 20 years later, I went back as a senator. I served for 4 years instead of 2 years. One dinner that I have with a colleague for 4 years, compared to probably 2 a month, 3 a month when I was in the Senate. It's changed, and it's changed both in terms of the concentration on district stuff to the exclusion of the collegial activities that we want to see in a legislature, and it's changed because of the partisanship. Much stronger, much more ideological, much more
Koch brothers investing in the state level to get assholes elected, basically, just like they're doing all over the country, destroying. That's what all the gerrymandering is about, all around the country. So that's what it is then. Koch brothers.
No.
That's what Koch brothers is. It's the doing of Koch brothers.
Is there coke plenty in New Jersey?
Everywhere.
Oh, yeah, there is. So, yes, you're right. There is, that has certainly changed. And by the way, it's the U.S. Supreme Court, which has done the most probably to change that going forward, which was Citizens United, and the complete collapse of public funding and public transparency. Richard?
Well, you painted a pretty clear picture of a long history of uninformed decisions by the three houses of government and the corresponding electorate that supported those people. How do we inform the three houses of government and the electorate to at least put the facts down before you make a decision and you vote?
Well, how do you change the culture of legislative politics in New Jersey? Not easily. I don't think there's a good answer to that. I really don't. I think if you had better information in place, if you could inform more people, if you could organize people, I don't know how you do that in this state to be effective.
Recruit people to be vocal and create that across
Right.
modern day.
Right.
But in order to change the culture, you have to do away with and affect the politicians that are in the system themselves.
You have to have what?
Well, in order to change the culture of politics within New Jersey, you have to get rid of the uninformed and the individuals who are screwing up our system of government.
Okay.
Yeah, the
I
elected
believe enough in the
officials.
system that I'll put my cards to doing it right and let people decide and make a proper decision.
You have to like the whole system.
Let's take an example that's in play right now in terms of the observations about how you improve the quality of deliberation and of decision-making in the legislative process. This is 2015. This is the first time since 1999 that the Assembly has been at the top of the ballot. Okay? The last time the Assembly was at the top of the ballot, voter turnout, as I recall, was 31 or 32% of registered voters. Now, that means that The people who are voting at a time when the assembly is at the top by itself are party loyalists and fanatical citizens, right? And so the information that you have about the assembly races, with the exception in this county of the 38th district, where you've had a candidate who resigned and is now back and running against with his partner against two incumbents. That's gotten some attention. Nothing else has gotten much attention. There are two races down in the Atlantic and Cape May and Cumberland that have gotten attention. Gee, none of the other races are thought to be changeable. I mean, all the incumbents who are running are all going to win. That's the way it looks. And they have evidence from the last assembly election when the numbers ended up the same, even though one Republican lost and one Democrat lost. But the numbers turned out to be exactly the same. So it's not only is the decision making in Trenton top down, but in a lot of counties, the decision making about who gets to run for these offices is also top down. So if you're in Hudson County or in Camden County or in Essex County or in maybe Bergen County, if you want to run, you've got to have the support of the organization. And when you have the support of the organization that guarantees you'll be the nominee, there are some exchanges that take place when you get to Trenton in terms of what you're expected to do. Two more questions.
You said earlier that maybe crisis would be enough to
Right.
mobilize some change in this. Isn't what you described a crisis as you're saying to me?
Yeah.
So why isn't it?
Okay. Well, okay, so we have two very big problems. We have the lack of funding for pensions and health benefits that have been committed and were supposed to be paid for and haven't been, with a huge overhang in front of us. Everybody who's entitled to a pension in New Jersey is still receiving a pension. They're still receiving the pension they were guaranteed to receive, with one exception. They're not getting a cost of living increase each year, adjusting their pension for inflation. Otherwise, everybody's getting paid. Who's complaining? Nobody's complaining, because it's all coming in. Now, that will end very shortly, but it's not going to end by the next gubernatorial election. It's not going to even end by the 2020 presidential election, but it might very well end as early as 2024. What's that? 8 years from now. Then the spigot will have to be turned down. Won't have to be turned off, but it'll have to be turned down. The pensions will not have the assets required to make the full pension payments to every recipient come 2020. In the case of civil servants, comes 2024, in the 27 in the case of teachers, and comes in 2020 in the case of judges. Yes, sir.
Just to follow up on what the professor just said, it seems like what you're saying is crisis is the only catalyst for change. It's no different in the federal government than it is in the state government nowadays. When I think about what you said, it's a factor of money. And the way our system is now, you just described how difficult it is to get appointed or elected in this
That's right. And it's harder and harder to find out because it's,
We're told what the politicians want us to know.
well, yeah, that's part of it. No, yeah, but it actually has opened up a bit more than even that, though, in terms of the internet being a source of information, some of which is credible and some of which is not, and no way to distinguish between the two. So it's changed. I mean, it was not long ago, that is in 1965, a year I picked as the start of a transformational set of changes in New Jersey. In 1965, every county had its own newspaper. Essex County had two. Morris County had two. Union County had two. But every county had their own newspaper and with pretty high circulations. We had the highest newspaper circulation per household of any state in the Union, largely because we didn't have any television.